Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the... What month are we in?
August.
August. Oh, August. Welcome, everyone, to this Hunter Living Histories meeting and or showcase. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are meeting on today at the university, which is the Awabakal people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. And I also want to pay my respects to people beaming in to us from all the Zoom lands, and pay my respects to your traditional custodians as well, their elders, past, present and emerging. And also welcome any Indigenous peoples who are joining us today, and welcome to them. Now, Jeff isn't with us yet, or I hope he is. I don't think he's joined us yet. But anyway, we have our presenter here ready, which is Ross Edmonds, who's coming to speak to us today. Did you want to introduce him, Anne?
Yes, Ross is known to many of us as long-term community researcher and member of various history societies and groups. And he's here today to talk about his research into Jumaric and Lieutenant, not Daring, but Darling.
Yes.
Lieutenant Darling. So yeah, I'll hand over to you.
Can you put up the first slide?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks to people here and the people online. Let me begin, and look, if you can't hear me at any stage, I'm an ex-teacher, so I'm used to raising my voice, but if you can't hear me at any stage, wave at me or you should jump up and down. Let me begin by clearing up any confusion about the pronunciation of the name Jumaric and that of Somers. These were names from the Channel Islands and originally French, so people sometimes don't get it right. But one of my grandfathers attended the Jumaric Public School, and some of my ancestors lived in the locality called Jumaric, and I, with my parents, lived in the Jumaric Shire before it was amalgamated with Armidale City Council about 1970. I should know how to pronounce them. Some of my ancestors attended the Somers Pond School as well, and I have here an original photo. I don't know if the camera can take that, but I'm happy for that to be passed around too. That's a photo of the Jumaric cricket team taken, I think, in 1904. And this photo here is of St Nicholas's Church of England at Somers Ponds, and it's the choir that includes two of my grandparents, numerous great aunts and uncles and other relatives. So to place the Jumarics in some context, I'll just ask, this is to make sure that people are paying attention. Who was the governor that followed Macquarie after he left, I think in 1822? Anyone? Oh, come on, I'm not teaching the third class up at Rutherford now. No one knows what governor followed Macquarie? Brisbane, yes, thank you. And then which governor then followed Brisbane? I think left in 1825, I think. Who became governor then? Oh, no one knows any early Australian history.
No, we're taught American English.
Well, it was. No one knows who was after Brisbane.
What do you make a mistake, Ross?
Gianni de Gravio.
No, it wasn't Johnny de Grovio,
I wasn't
no.
here, yes.
It was Governor Ralph Darling.
Darling.
Yes.
Close.
Okay.
I was going to say,
Johnny's a darling, so he would have been good.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say darling,
I'll-
but
I'll
I'm so
let it-
close to Ross. I didn't want to.
Yeah, okay. I can see that this talk's going downhill already. So where am I up to? So by and large, New South Wales was fortunate with its early governors. Most were honest, most were humane. However, Ralph Darling was, by the standards of the time, pretty average. Okay, now back to the numerics. Firstly, Henry. Now he was born in 1792, and his brother William the next year, 1793. Henry, we'll see later a photograph of William, who didn't die until 1868, but Henry died in 1838, which is just prior to the arrival of the first photographic studio in Sydney. Henry attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, and this, as it turned out, was a mistake, because it's all right being an army officer when you're at peace, but for most of the early part of the 19th century, Britain was at war. And so Henry served as an officer in Spain, then in Canada, and then in 1815. Now, this is your last chance to redeem yourselves. In 1815, at the famous Battle of Waterloo, yes, thank you. At least someone here is paying attention. And that was a mistake too, because it was there that he was badly wounded and lucky to survive. He then served with the army in Mauritius from 1818 to 1825, where he served as secretary to his commanding officer, Ralph Darling, who by this time was also his brother-in-law, as Darling had married Henry's sister, Eliza. When Darling accepted the position of Governor of New South Wales in 1825, he asked Henry to come with him and continue as his secretary, which he did. Henry's brother William also came with them, seeing an opportunity to get rich quick in the infant colony, where land and labour to work it were almost free. William was appointed to the position of civil engineer and inspector of roads. And so with his brother Henry being secretary, both positions were well paid. And that then, on top of that, they were also given large land grants in the Upper Hunter. Henry's grant was near Muswellbrook, and he called it St Heliers. William's grant was near Scone. It was called St Albans. These were named after ancestral properties in the Channel Islands. Now, it was Darling's misfortune to become governor just after something approaching a free press had been established in Sydney. This was been established in 1824. So prior to that, the Government Gazette, which goes back, I think, to 1803, had come out, but it was censored, and so nothing went in there that the governor didn't want to go in there. But in 1824, William Wentworth, W.C. Wentworth, who at the time was young and something of a radical, began a newspaper called The Australian. The other paper that began that year was called The Monitor, run by Edward Smith Hall, who ended up serving a few short terms in jail for his outspokenness. These papers were soon accusing Darling of nepotism and criticising most of his other policies and actions. To make matters worse, the Chief Justice, Sir Francis Forbes, sent a report to London raising objections to Darling's nepotism. By return mail, the government gave Darling a rap over the knuckles and told him to cancel the government appointments of the Jumeric brothers. Their large land grants, however, were not rescinded, and soon they took out squatting licences on huge tracts of land in New England. Henry took up land between what is now Armidale and Uralla and called it Somers, while William took up land northeast of Armidale and called his property Tilbuster. So, while ever the original inhabitants of the land could be dispossessed of it relatively easily, land was plentiful. Now, by contrast, there's something even more important than land. Now, I'm not going to get you to guess what that is. I'll tell you. It's women. Now, of course, that depends on your point of view. I mean, it was a time when I thought women were more important than food. But anyway, Henry, and they were particularly short of well-bred women. I mean, obviously the Jumerics did not want to be put in the position of having to marry a female convict or ex-convict. So Jumeric took the long and arduous and dangerous trip back to England, where he married, Sophia Butler Danvers, Elizabeth Sophia Butler Danvers. The couple then returned the following year, 1829, to New South Wales. Meanwhile, William had been more fortunate, was able to find a suitable wife in Sydney. Her name was Christina Susan Macleay, the daughter of Alexander Macleay, who was the colonial secretary, one of the most powerful men in the colony, and also one of the richest. So, to make things even better for the elite in New South Wales, during this period, they were also supplied with virtually free labour in the form of convicts. Some people treated their convicts better than others. For example, at James Moody's property, Castle Forbes, some were treated so badly it prompted an uprising in 1833, with tragic consequences of which most of you would be aware. By contrast, convicts on the Jumeric properties were treated more humanely, and this is recorded by various sources. John Dunmore Lang said the estates of the Jumerics were among the best regulated in the colony, and that the law on Henry's estate, he says, is one of kindness, and that rewards were put in place as an incentive to industry and good behaviour. Apparently it worked. James Backhouse, who wrote some of the history of the time, and others echoed these sentiments. The soon-to-be famous explorer Edward John Eyre visited St Heliers in 1833 and found it to be, and I quote, the best ordered and best managed station on the Hunter. Henry was appointed commissioner of the AA Company in 1833, and the following year moved to their headquarters at Port Stephens. This, of course, was before the headquarters was moved to Stroud. Henry died at Tarlee House in 1838, his premature death being attributed to his war injuries. And his body was taken to St Heliers, where it is buried. His widow and children returned to England a few years later, and his brother William was left to manage the property until it was sold. William had better luck. He became wealthy, purchased a large house, which he called Tivoli at Rose Bay, which at the time was on the outskirts of Sydney. After 1840, he lived with his family most of the time, but maintained connections with St Albans and Scone, donating money to help build St Luke's Church of England, as well as the hospital at Scone. He represented the Upper Hunter in the Legislative Council during the 1840s and 50s, but after electoral reforms granted all adult males to vote in 1858, he went into retirement. The age of the squatters in New South Wales was finally over. After his wife died in 1866, William moved to Queensland to live with one of his daughters and died 2 years later. As an aside, the daughter was married to Louis Hope, who was the brother of the 5th Earl of Hopetoun. Now, does that ring any bells for any?
Hopetoun, the town.
Yes, but who was the town named after?
Hopetoun.
Yes, and why would Hopetoun have a town named after him, as well as the streets and other things?
Because he knew someone.
Well, he knew a lot of people. Hopetoun was the first Governor-General of Australia. And so it was the daughter of William, who'd married Louis Hope, was related. So, and so it was the 7th Earl of Hopetoun who, at Sydney on the 1st of January 1901, was sworn in as the first Governor-General. He then in turn swore in an interim cabinet, who then arranged for elections of members to the first federal parliament, which of course was in Melbourne. Now, I apologise to anyone who's familiar with this poem by Hilaire Belloc, but it relates to the Hopetouns coming out to as governors and then later Governor-General. It happened to Lord Lundy then, as happens to so many men. Towards the age of 26, they shoved him into politics, in which profession he commanded the income that his rank demanded. In turn, as Secretary for India, the colonies and war, but very soon his friends began to doubt if he was quite the man. Thus, if a member rose to say, as members do from day to day, arising out of that reply, Lord Lundy would begin to cry. A hint at harmless little jobs would shake him with convulsive sobs. Well, as for revelations, these would simply bring him to his knees and leave him whimpering like a child. It drove his colleagues raving wild. They let him sink from post to post, from 1,500 at the most, to 8 and barely 6, and then to be curator of Big Ben. And finally, there came a threat to oust him from the cabinet. The Duke, his aged grandsire, bore the shame till he could bear no more. He rallied his declining powers, and summoning the youth to Brackley Towers, and bitterly addressed him thus: "Sir, you have disappointed us. We had intended you to be the next Prime Minister, but 3. The stocks were sold, the press was squared, the middle class was quite prepared. But as it is, my language fails. Go out and govern New South Wales." So that's where junior aristocrats were sent at the time. Now, if you remember the name of the wife of Henry Jemerick, Elizabeth Sophia Butler Danvers, of course, once she was married, she became simply Mrs. Henry Jemerick. Well, in 1828, she was given a small book of Psalms, which had been published by Robert Howe in Sydney, Robert being the son of the first printer, and who gave her this book, none other than her brother-in-law, Governor Darling. And where is the book now? Well, it's here. Whether she took it back to England when she returned there shortly after her husband had died, or whether it was left in Australia, I don't know, but it turned up at Horton House, rather a small book. You can guess what it might have cost. If you said $500, you'd be right as long as you added on another $26,000. But of course, it's not worth that much. I mean, I can't imagine that
So threepence.
that anyone, even with more money than sense, would pay that much. But anyway, it came up in another auction 6 months ago, and I paid a little less than $2,000 for it. But I don't know if we can see it on this. It says Lieutenant General Darling, Government House, to Mrs. H. Jumeric.
Yeah.
And so this is an example. I'll also show the title page. This is an example of a book where the provenance is, most of the value of it. Thanks, John. Now, I think, has anyone got any questions?
Who was the Miss Maclay? Who did she marry? Jumeric?
She married Henry's brother, William. Yes. Any other questions? So, yeah, the Jumerics are still, the name is still perpetuated. There's no river runs through Armidale's Creek, and that's Jumeric Creek. There's also Jumeric Street.
In Hamilton.
Yes, in Hamilton as well as in, and I presume the one in Hamilton was also named after one of the Jumerics. I think William, or maybe Henry too, owned land in Newcastle at one stage.
Were they generous in their gifts? You know how other early landowners, gave land to build churches and that sort of thing.
Well, I mentioned about William giving money for the church in Scone and to the hospital. I don't know, but they were certainly treated their convicts more humanely than some others. Look, I can't resist mentioning the Uni Book Fair. Leslie can tell you more about that later, but it's starting next week on the Friday late afternoon, but then the following
the 16th.
Yeah, the 16th, but then all day on the Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So there will be bargains to be had. Okay. Thanks.
Was Jumeric Street in Hamilton AA Company land,
I don't know, but
their subdivision?
that could have been the connection.
I think it was, because when it was then the garden
Yes.
suburb and there's Hull Street.
Oh, of course.
And those
Yes.
names relate to
Yes.
AA Company.
Yes. Yes, I was probably named when
They sold it off.
Henry was the commissioner.
Yes, he was commissioner.
Like the streets in Cooks Hill?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross.
Jeff's zooming
Yes,
in.
Ross.
Jeff is zooming in.
Oh, Jeff is zooming in?
Yeah,
Jeff, where are you?
he's down in the reading room zooming in.
Is he? Okay, well, look, we have a guest with us for a couple of days who's visiting from England, who's doing a study on Muswellbrook. So I asked him to do a quick introduction for us with the intention that you would be here, Leslie Gent, because you would be fantastic with these sorts of topics. So, Jeff, do you want to just give us a very quick rundown on why you're here, what you're studying and what you would love to do?
Just got to, you're just on mute, Jeff.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So hello everyone. So I've come from the UK. I was born in Hatter Valley. I was born in Muswellbrook. I left Muswellbrook in '94 to go to Sydney and left Sydney in 2007. So I'm a filmmaker, photographer, and I'm returning back to my roots to kind of explore. I think look at the Hunter Valley with fresh eyes, not those child eyes that I grew up with. So I'm currently looking at the actual place itself and using, I'm interested in my memories, but also how those memories relate to the history of the region, and how that whole history of the region was not a part of my upbringing. And I'm really curious about why, those details of the hunter aren't a part of, common knowledge, I guess. That's one aspect of my project. And so I'm really just starting out. I'm just having a look at the scope of the information that there is, and I'm already quite daunted by the task, but it's exciting as well. So I'm also excited to see that that there's obviously a real interest in the history. I see that you guys are really focused on this, and so I'm privileged to be a part of it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. All right, so if anyone's got any ideas or sources, so
Want me to talk about the book fair?
who wants to talk
Do you
about
want me to talk about
it?
the
Not yet. We'll get to the City of Newcastle folk yet, and then we'll do the book fair. All right, thank you very much, Jeff. We'll stay in touch, and
Okay, I'll listen in.
and you're listening.
Thank
If
you.
we get some time, Leslie will tell you everything about Muswellbrook that she knows, because she's very...
Johnny,
Yes.
I can interrupt for a minute. Hey, Jeff.
Yep.
I spent fair bits of my childhood in Muswellbrook. My mother and father both grew up there.
Right.
And my father produced his sketches of Muswellbrook 1934 to 1936.
Incredible.
Obviously, I have that.
All right.
I'm currently finishing a novel that's largely set in Muswellbrook in 1942. So I've actually been in touch with local history, etc., in Muswellbrook regarding that novel.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure what angles you're coming in at in terms of Muswellbrook, the township.
Yeah.
I too have my childhood memories because many of my holidays were spent there, and I'm a Walsh and also a McTaggart, and they're quite reasonably famous Muswellbrook names.
Yeah.
But most of my friends and relatives are now in the graveyard at Muswellbrook, so they can't really speak to you. But if you want to have a conversation or a hand, Gianni knows how to find me.
Okay. I would really appreciate that. Where are you living in Newcastle?
Yes, I'm in New Lambton, mate.
Okay.
And I'm sort of oscillating a bit with Muswellbrook as well.
Right.
So I don't know whether I'd probably be of some help to you, my friend, but it just depends what it is your outcomes are focused on. I know how hard that is.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, I'm just exploring. So it'd be great to have a conversation, and I'd love to see those sketches as well.
Yeah, he went to war, sadly, and never sketched again after serving in Borneo and other places.
Yeah.
I'll give you a little hang on. That's probably like, I don't know, there's the family home, for instance, in Foley Street.
They're really beautiful, yeah.
He did a lot of detail. We've got the gas works, things that are no longer there. But we also got out of him before he died descriptions of the background to the sketches. So in that particular pictorial, we can tell you what all the buildings are and who was in them.
Right. Wait, do you know whereabouts in Muswellbrook is that? Is that north?
That's looking down over the back of Market Lane.
Yeah.
Looking towards the railway station in Market Street.
Okay.
And it's got Hornery Brothers Garage. I'm linked into the Hornerys as well. They're all my cousins, first cousins. So,
right.
Yeah, I still got a fair few contacts up there. Like my cousin Tony McTaggart's the leading real estate agent.
Yeah.
He's been helping me a lot with research on the novel.
Yeah.
So, mate, yeah, if Johnny gives you my contact details, happy to hear from you if I can be of any help.
That'd be great. I'll send you an email. Thanks a lot.
No worries.
Cheers, man.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Jim.
No, thank you very much for showing the magic of what this place does sometimes. The connections are very interesting. I just knew that there would be someone here that could help.
You did.
Anyway, thank you. Okay, now, thank you to our patiently waiting officers of the City of Newcastle. Tom Smith, Heritage Planner, is here in person. and he will be introducing the work of the thematic study, the historical or heritage thematic study, is that the term?
Thematic history.
Thematic history
Yeah.
that they're working on, and he'll be introducing his colleagues from GML, Mina and Leonie. So over to you, Tom.
Okay, so this is we're here today just to really give a broad overview of the project that's GML and City of Newcastle have kicked off, and I'll provide the sort of just a couple of slides with the strategic context and where we're coming from in terms of City of Newcastle, and Minna and Leonie will give a far more detailed. There they are. Good afternoon. They're based in Sydney, GML, and they're the consultants engaged by council to prepare this thematic history, very much involved with City of Newcastle. And they'll go into far more depth about what is a thematic history and what is not a thematic history and how it all fits in. So, yeah. So the sort of strategic overview is it slots very nicely thematic history into the very high level priorities and commitments. We've got you might remember, we did a heritage strategy about 5 years ago. And following on from that, we've updated our policy, and there's these sort of firm commitments to review our heritage study for the whole of the city. So we've got and also tailored in with that, we've got very much councillor support with notice of motion back just before Christmas last year. So there's a very strong political support, very strong City of Newcastle managerial support to get going on a citywide heritage study. So we've got an existing study by Suitors from 1997, and it's extremely old and dusty. It needs a really good review, revamp. It's a very good study, don't get me wrong, and it underpins everything that my team does in terms of heritage studies and listings and all the kind of stuff that follows. But 97, the world has moved on since 97. So there's a really, really strong need. I imagine the room can feel it as well. There's a lot of development going on in Newcastle, certainly in the past sort of 10 years or so. And we're coming up against a lot of ad hoc kind of protections. You might have seen the IHOs, the interim heritage orders. There's about 3 of them this year in Mayfield, which is fantastic, but we can't keep doing that. It's not clever from a overview, because we could be missing places that actually also do need stronger heritage protections. So from 97, the things have changed. The whole framework, New South Wales assessment for listing heritage items and listing conservation areas has completely changed since that 97 study. And also we've got a very, very weak protections in terms of studies for Aboriginal. So this won't necessarily fall under the thematic history straight away, but that's something I'll explain in the next slide. So yeah, there's increasing development pressure, and we need a much stronger, holistic, broad overview of what is going on in the city. What do we value? What are the gaps? What are we strong at? What are we weak at? Told through all the stories in particular. So the thematic history will inform future heritage studies like listed buildings and conservation areas and the Aboriginal studies. And also it informed from the get-go heritage assessments in terms of development applications, the load of infrastructure work that we do across the city. And also it informs our cultural collections. And, University of Newcastle, you could quite happily use it as well to sort of find out what in those collections there's gaps, and inform, exhibitions from museums, etc. So a really, really useful document. Again, GML will explain in greater detail, and there's the Hornsby example floating around. So this is just a high level view to say how the heck does it fit in? The thematic history is the first step in what sits below a number of other studies. So it underpins everything else that follows. So there's no point doing heritage item studies or Aboriginal studies or conservation area studies or character if we don't know what the big picture is. So that's really the purpose of the thematic history. So City of Newcastle and GML have started sort of investigations. A lot of GML's done a lot of historical research already. And what we're setting up at the moment is we've targeted Aboriginal stakeholders and non-Aboriginal stakeholders to help us in that drafting process. For the sort of key message today is please, for the rest of you who haven't been picked on yet, please sit tight, sit on your hands. I know you're absolutely desperate to get stuck into this, but we're going to an exhibition at the end of the year. By the end of the year, there'll be a good public exhibition where you can pour all over the draft document, comments, everything, and we can take those on board and then come up with a final document. So the final document would be sort of early next year. Will then get adopted by council and have that real teeth to then launch into the other studies. So that's really me in a nutshell for the City of Newcastle for the moment. But hand over to GML, who will then go in more details, and then we'll have questions at the end.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tom. Hello, everyone. We're really thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for making a time in your agenda. My name is Minna Mulan-Schulte, and this is my colleague, Leo Matson. Yes.
Okay, can everyone see that on the screen?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So just a bit about who GML Heritage is, if you haven't come across us before. We've been around since 1989, and we're made up of several different service areas. So that includes Aboriginal cultural heritage and archaeology, interpretation and design, landscape, urban built heritage specialists, and also ourselves, historians, and we work within a lot of these teams providing research. We're both members of the Professional Historians Association, and we've done a few of these thematic histories now, so we're really happy to share with you some examples today and just give a sense of what they look like and, yeah, build a bit more on that purpose, as Tom mentioned, of why these things get commissioned. Just a bit about myself. I'm completed a Master's in Public History at Monash about 10 years ago, and have been working in that sort of consulting professional historian environment since that time. So in Melbourne, also completed some fellowship research for the library there and some for the New South Wales government here, and then have been at GML about 7 years. And this is probably about our 5th thematic history working together.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually a Lake Macquarie girl by background. So I grew up in Belmont, and of course, Belmont, right next door to Newcastle, was in and out of the boundaries of Newcastle pretty much most of the time. I trained as a librarian and have worked for 25 years as a local history librarian. So my background is in resources and locating resources and collecting and cataloguing. And I've been in several heritage consultancies for the last 10 to 12 years, and I've been at GML for about 4.5. So, so that's me in a nutshell. Thanks.
So just to expand a bit on where Tom was headed, the thematic history sort of emerged from, I guess, New South Wales heritage policies. There's a document probably going around now for about 20 years, but essentially it's that background document that is used by council and government to provide that overview of an area, really giving that course and pattern of what is distinctive. So it explains why the local government area looks like it does today, picks up those aspects of an area, including the historic physical fabric, but it's not an exhaustive heritage study. It's really building that narrative, and to build that narrative of an area, it focuses on themes. So it's not intended to in any way substitute detailed histories, including genealogical histories or chronological histories, or many of the specialist areas, I suppose, that the Hunter Living Histories group really excel at, and your publications, your presentations, you know, it's such a wonderful resource that we've been looking at, and in many ways very daunting in terms of, you know, we absolutely won't be able to capture everything you guys are doing, but we're hoping to build a thematic framework that at least picks up on some of those really distinct things that convey what Newcastle is, and why is it different to other areas of New South Wales, or what is it that stands out. So what the government had also done over the years is developed New South Wales state heritage themes, and then on top of that, at a national level, there's another set of national heritage themes. So these histories are sort of positioned in that context as well, but those themes are incredibly broad, and they're numerous. So at a state level, there's 36 themes, and these were identified in 2001 by the Heritage Council. And really, just to be, I guess, very clear about these, as you can see, they're quite generic, and they would apply to a lot of areas in New South Wales, as is the intention. But they're not to be used, I guess, as a shopping list. So we don't like to approach these histories and sort of just tick off each of these and go through, because what we really want to pull out is the unique story of Newcastle. And while obviously it will hit on a lot of these, we certainly don't want to structure the document via, you know, environment down to birth and death, because obviously something like that becomes quite unwieldy, and you lose a sense of place if you're just sort of working through a dot point list.
And partly as well, in terms of the guidance from the Heritage Council, some of these themes do cross over. So sometimes we might link a few themes and rename them, or come up with a more unique identity that relates to Newcastle, for instance. And also they have a generally, as you can see in that list from top to bottom on the second column, they generally sort of have a chronological guidance. So we can't help but in our documents, sometimes it has a slightly chronological sequence, because we're looking at the area from a sort of a pre-settlement perspective through to what's happening in current affairs and what's happening in an area in physical terms in the present.
So as Tom mentioned, there's a sort of bigger heritage purpose here for council around helping identify that management of the city, including conservation outcomes, but also that capacity for it to guide interpretation outcomes, so other ways to tell the stories, which you guys are already brilliantly doing in so many ways. I guess as a civic document also, it's that opportunity to reflect back the city's voice, and capture your voice and the community's sense of place, and what you regard as the shaping force and pattern and events that have really characterised and continue to characterise the Newcastle city, and that it can hopefully have a bit of a life as a document, so that it, you know, doesn't just sit there. As Tom said, you know, that one has now been from 1997, and there's obviously a lot has happened in Newcastle's history in those last couple of decades that deserves to be caught in this document. So hoping to give it a bit of life in this next iteration, and hoping as well, I guess, to capture some of that sensational collections you have and photos, and there's so many iconic collections to feature. And one of the things we want to build on from the Suter study, I guess, is just that capacity now to to bring in graphics and photographs and media and oral history interviews and some of those quotes and voices too, so that yeah, we can sort of break it out of a bit more of the traditional way these things have been done. So our approach, I guess, has been so far, yeah, getting our sense of the 1996-1997 study, understanding sort of the gaps there. I think one of the big ones mentioned in the brief to us was there wasn't a First Nations section, so we're going to work with the Gurukkai Advisory Committee, as well as obviously the extensive secondary and primary resource material that is out there, to make sure that we can include that history in there. We also thought there's probably some gaps around, we'd like to see some more women in that history. We'd like to see some of the more contemporary history in there, and some of the more planning stories as well. So surfacing some other voices in there would be one of our aims. Then our next sort of stage is to identify a set of themes that we think start to build that narrative, and understand how we're aligning that to the New South Wales state themes. And then sort of come back to the group that we're working with Tom to sort of go through those themes, but also, as he mentioned, bring it out wider on public exhibitions so that everybody can really have a look at where the themes have gone to, what stories we've identified. And then it's a sort of iterative thing, I suppose, then of taking that feedback back and also identifying other sources that we might have missed there and polishing up that document. So just to give you a sense of where the 1997 thematic history landed, Leonie, you might want to just speak to that slide.
So in the Suter study, they identified 5 broad themes, as you can see across the top in orange, and within that they looked at particular aspects that relate to that overarching theme. So this is where you sort of can start to sort of connect some of those smaller themes under a broader heading. So obviously pattern of settlement is that very early settlement of Newcastle region, bringing in some sort of development through into the colonial and perhaps late Victorian period. Economic development, I think, is pretty straightforward. It's looking at sort of how the sort of land and the sort of the landscape was sort of mediated by Europeans in terms of making sort of viable financial and economic decisions as part of the colonial development and beyond. Obviously, the role of government, for instance, the number of numerous councils that used to cover what is now one single sort of LGA, and sort of the utilities that sort of come under that sort of broad role. Social development, I guess, is quite straightforward. So this is where the people story is coming up, as well as sort of where that may land within the sort of the geographic sort of boundaries of Newcastle. And then obviously some significant people coming in under associations and influences. So that's how it broadly spreads out. And I'm sure if you've seen that document, they also have a sort of bit of history, summary history over 4 quadrants at the beginning of the report, which will sort of has influenced their decision on how they broke up themes for the development of Newcastle at that point. And
we just wanted to share with you some of our other recent work, just to give you a sense of
what we can do and how we've presented previous thematic histories.
So this is one we prepared for. Sorry if I make you a bit car sick too. I'm just going to try and sort of whiz through, but give you a sense of the layout. So certainly want to present it in a sort of publishable form. This was one for Northern Beaches, but obviously highlighting that beautiful historic imagery, giving a bit of an overview. And then you see we start to sort of break into themes, and where possible also capturing information in a graphic form, being able to sort of give those snapshot features of a place without having to, I guess, really deep dive into every aspect of geology, ecology, because, yeah, it can't hold that level of detail. So certainly this history featured the First Nation section as well. And I guess you can see with the themes, just trying to actually pick up what's distinctive about Northern Beaches rather than perhaps just saying transport and then going into a chronology of transport. So something that characterised Northern Beaches was its isolation for a long time and its very slow settlement. And so really what shaped its significant development was introduction of transport and how it then connected to the city. So surveys and settlement, I mean, that's applicable to a lot of places in Australia, but again, just showing that development, giving a sense to heritage planners and our audience in the back of our minds about how suburbs develop. So certainly getting into suburban form and planning.
Like Newcastle, there's a very strong sort of a weekender and holiday associated with parts of the Northern Beaches, and that's a very strong theme in Northern Beaches, for instance. But we look at how we can, if that's a strong theme for Newcastle or not, we'll be developing over the period of this research and writing stage.
Yeah, so similarly, like trying to present a sort of contemporary history in this history as well, and looking at new suburbs and landscapes, as Leonie said, that came out of some of that camp culture as well, but into contemporary architecture. So some of the things that we felt previous histories hadn't necessarily captured in that later, more contemporary 20th century, mid-20th to 21st century, including social and cultural things like surf as well is obviously really key to Northern Beaches, and is not necessarily captured when I suppose you just use a New South Wales heritage theme of recreation. So giving a sense of some of those really iconic architectural features. Again, some of the contemporary band and music and surf culture. And then in this instance, we did a really select timeline as well to capture some of those more specific events community wanted to see captured, but wouldn't necessarily be built into the history. Ones for people in the room, or for people who aren't in the room, the one that's been handed around is Hornsby. Obviously a much more contained local government area than Newcastle, but again, just to give a sense of how we developed this document and structured it. So again, they really wanted to have a lot of the contemporary Darug community included in the document, which hadn't previously been acknowledged, but given its co-location to the Hawkesbury is really significant. For the Hornsby area, the bushland shire really characterises to them and reflects their sense of identity there, of just how green it's sort of known as the lungs of Sydney. So it became a really specific theme, but as did how it's come under threat. Transport speaks for itself, and often these histories, as you can see from a couple, is really important to tell as part of the course and pattern and development of a place like Hornsby, and obviously dramatic images like that really sum up how it became linked.
Very strong dairying and orchard area, so that's a very defining, unique feature, and it still forms a part of the Hornsby Shire, particularly on the west side of Galston Gorge. But yes, it's something that Hornsby very much it connects to very strongly even today, with still a lot of farms and a lot of floristry businesses, etc. And what you wouldn't associate with Hornsby is a level of industry that existed that probably is in common with a lot of areas, but that sort of early logging through other sort of forms of heavy industry, particularly along the railway line, because it facilitated transport of goods. And I think, what do we have here?
Something else that's really important to the fabric and development of Hornsby is there's a lot of faith-based organisations and infrastructure there, so building up a bit of a picture for them there, but also trying to link back in First Nations culture into that, which has been there time immemorial, obviously. And then I guess just the third example, I don't need to go through that exhaustively, but the third example was just a recent one Leonie's worked on for Wallara, and this is quite specific to a period of buildings that.
Yeah. So we just recently, it's shortly to be published, but the council, as you know, Wallara sits above the harbour. It's a sort of a prime, prominent position on the harbour with a lot of wealthy and higher sort of socioeconomic status of net worth. And a significant part of their history is tied into the early apartment buildings and some significant architectural iconic pieces in that interwar period. So they tasked us with sort of giving them a sort of a cross-section of what was happening in Wallara in the interwar period and how it influenced perhaps the built environment and the sort of the physical landscape. So looking at the interwar period, again, in similar to some of our other studies, making it a fairly graphic, well-presented report supported by interesting text and examples. So looking at various themes, so the development of the mansion sites into these housing estates with these really recognised and prominent sort of apartment buildings, luxury apartment buildings of their time, with case studies. Transport was a sort of, I think it's a defining feature for many LGAs, but how that's impacted on their environment in terms of what survived as well, potentially. Remnants of tramways, remnants of ferry wharves, roadways, etc. So the motor car is obviously the overwhelmingly major part of the community these days. And garages, for instance, is a prominent one. But getting through transport and some of the infrastructure that still exists that the council's interested in, perhaps from a significance perspective, looking at apartment living and apartment buildings, which were a large part of that area. But you can get an idea of how we've structured the report with key stories and overviews. I won't show the rest of it because it's quite long, but then we'll also looked at architectural styles, which will probably be part of a sort of an ongoing study for Newcastle down the track. But this was a specific, very specialised topic for another local government area.
That's really it from us, but would love to hear from you. Any questions you have about the study or our approach or suggestions. Yeah, I think it's certainly a very daunting task. We really enjoy doing these thematic histories, but I won't pretend that it will please everyone with what we produce, and I'm sure there'll be lots of things that people would love to see more chapters on or additional things. So yeah, I guess just keep that in mind, that it will be broad in its nature and it will give a sense of Newcastle, but perhaps not to the detail that you might have seen in other publications or histories because of its specific purpose in these planning environments. But yes, please, over to you. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes. Well, look, these sorts of things, I mean, looking at the 1997 thematic history and looking at this one, I'm just going to be very honest in terms of the approach. I feel like we're trying to tell a story that's already done, you know, and part of the work that we're involved with is more dramatic in terms of history. Might look like it's just a dead thing sitting there, but it's having effects on people now. Now, from our point of view, we love seeing all these buildings and we love seeing people doing all these wonderful, wonderful things. But to Aboriginal people, this sort of stuff brings them a great pain. You know, it might be good for us, but for them, it's like pain on every single page. And this only dawned on us recently when we had one of the Aboriginal elders here for a presentation, and I saw the whole of our Hunter Living Histories through her eyes, you know, squirming around on that seat. And I knew that everyone here loved what we were presenting, but to her, I mean, this is like all the wonderful things that we love celebrating bring great pain to these people, and that's why they don't sort of come to these gatherings. I really hope that we can come up with something different than just a slideshow at the beginning. to present what Aboriginal people are, and then we go on with everything else. I mean, something that came into my mind was similar to the very limited edition book that was done by the Beatles press publicist, Derek Taylor. You know, he and George Harrison had a wonderful relationship, and he wrote his autobiography of the Beatles. But George Harrison was able to stick in his point of view in a series of little quotations. So while Derek said his bit, George would then put his perspective in. You know, it's almost like I think we need an Aboriginal voice in there all the way through this thematic history, just to provide what it was like for them. It might not be pretty reading, but it helps us balance that sort of story. The thing with Newcastle, for me, it's more like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, instead of a story that's still happening. I mean, we are a prison within a prison that we've been trying to break out of with this information, because the information that we see here, I mean, might be like the documents, but for me, they're the ways that we break out of this mental prison that not only we are in, but also Aboriginal people. And see, Doug Lithgow for me is almost like that ageless guardian of the Grail that you find at the end of the story when Indiana Jones has to cross that boundary, and there's Doug holding that he's holding that sword protecting that Grail, and that Grail is our place, you know, what we are as a people, what we have demonstrated over time with an ongoing relationship with Aboriginal people in the history, and also what we need to give to the world, which is what we've learnt in our backyard. Anyway, I should shut up now, but I want something really new. To me, all this really is bland. It's had its day. It's really the same old story. What's it going to achieve? Is it going to make the world a better place? I mean, I've got people around the table that have been campaigning to save bits and pieces of Newcastle, and we just gave up. You know, we just decided to let people know about the story, hoping that once they know the story, they might feel some kind of connection to protect the physical landscape, because the archive is not the end in itself. We exist here in order to protect the outside world. We're not here to create a digital paradise of what was once here. It's all here to help educate us so that we can look after the planet out there. All right, because the cloud is not up there. The cloud is down here. It's a data center that bulldozes trees in order to create itself. So if we're going to digitize stuff, or we're going to put this stuff up, let's make it really meaningful and really meaningful. Because the Aboriginal people were the archivists before us, and they didn't have buildings to put their archive in. The archives are out there in the engraving sites, the painted caves, the dances, the rituals, the stories. And just like the landscape, we've been kicking it to death for the last 200 years, and we've also been kicking them to death for the last 200 years. So give me something that brings life, inspiration, and makes us very proud to be human beings.
Thank you, John. That's an excellent brief, and I can completely understand from you know, my training, as I mentioned, was public history, and certainly coming into the heritage world, it is a different prospect, grappling with history in that space. And certainly the way things are written historically is a challenge. And we have tried to evolve that a bit in the practice. Certainly with the First Nations content, I absolutely hear what you're saying, and we don't want to race past it and sort of say they were colonised, the end, and keep going. And we're going to work really closely with Tom and the Gurukkai committee on how that content is presented, and really be guided by them with that. And certainly sources that we've identified so far, we really want to continue that living cultural connection and contribution and language revival and the work of Ray Kelly, and you know, just how iconic people are, Aboriginal people are in the sporting life of Newcastle, right from boxing through to the Newcastle Knights. We know there's such a vibrant community there, and we certainly don't want to relegate it into any kind of colonial traditional heritage context or narrative. So yes, I guess continue to watch that space. We really want to be guided by Gurukkai on appropriate use of language and sources there. And stories. So hopefully we can do justice to some of what you're saying, but certainly I'm not expecting this document to replace the work that you guys do every day and live it. And I can appreciate, you know, the frustration of looking at things in a very desktop format here. but we'll do our best.
Could I add something too, Gianni?
Over to you.
Basically, as a white fella who's done a fair bit of work with Aboriginal people, I would love to see integrated into what you're doing, ladies, the modern evolution of the Aboriginal community in Newcastle and the surrounds, with a particular reference to the personal experience of Aboriginal people in relationship to that European-style evolution that's happened all around them. That Aboriginal people, a whole modern community has been established in Newcastle by virtue of work on the railways, all sorts of things attracted a whole amalgam of Aboriginal peoples into the city across time. And I feel that quite often, as I think what Gianni was referring to, is quite often in histories of places in Australia, it's almost as the Aboriginal people are a forward or a preface, and it's like we all go, well, that's finished, let's get on with all this white history, when in fact the Aboriginal community, of course, have been with us right throughout. And I just feel somehow you need to connect that continuity and look at modern Aboriginality and how it links in with the history, the evolving history of place. That would be number one. And the other one that I think John Witt could speak to, I also would like to see integrated for quite similar reasons in some ways, John. I don't mean to speak for you, but the history and evolution of the gay community in Newcastle, and likewise, it's a history of people having to deal with almost another civilization around them for quite a long time that treated them almost as non-humans. So I'll let John speak to that, but I just felt to mention that one as well.
Thank you. We've definitely like to do what you're saying of capture some contemporary Aboriginal community in there, and we've identified some really fantastic oral histories as well, and very much what you're saying, contribution to rail and labour history and pubs as well, and Aboriginal cultural life there that's contributed on so many aspects. So
yeah, and family history is an integral part of that. I think it's really important to recognise that the tremendous strength of Aboriginal families throughout all of that as a part of a survival mechanism within our broader culture, so that it's not just institutional history, it's personal history. And I think that's sort of what I was referring to with the gay community as well, that it's about personal interactions with the broader history. I'm not suggesting that both those groups are not part of that history. Of course they are, but there is another story within a story to be told there, I feel.
Yeah.
But I accept that you can only do what you can do, ladies, and thanks for the presentation.
John,
you go, John.
Well,
and Robert.
as a matter of fact, I'm nearly finishing that thing I started during COVID, and it's now basically it's going to be called Smaller Lives, which was a word that Chris Minns used for the apology, and it'll cover the impact that the law had on the gay community in Newcastle from 1840 to 1977. And I've just gone through what was in Trove and what was what I found in the Layman Street Library to sort of build up some sort of idea of what gay men were doing. And it's really quite interesting. I'm going to present it at the National Queer Conference in Melbourne in September. So there should be something I could have for you when we meet up, when we have that meeting you suggested.
Thank you, John. That's really generous of you to share your scholarship. We'll be thrilled to read it, and anything that we can reference that you feel comfortable with would be excellent. This probably will race a bit ahead of your publications in terms of public exhibition, but certainly would like to point it towards anything that you would like to surface in it. Yeah.
Okay.
Robert.
Yeah, one of the things I guess Johnny was talking about was, you know, back in the early days, everything that you're going to cover as Indigenous or Aboriginal or whatever. And of course, we're now in 2024 and we have the city of Newcastle. But one of the things that I've been working on and aware of is that Newcastle is made up of over a dozen original coal mining townships, which were then amalgamated. And so in the studies that you've done before, have you done something similar to that, where there's a whole bunch of different places created and then amalgamated?
That was definitely a challenge, Robert, with Northern Beaches, because that used to be sort of, well, from a government perspective, maybe less so what you're saying from a historical demarcation there, but it used to be Warringah, Manly, and Pittwater. And certainly when that council amalgamated, there was also an amalgamation literally of collections and histories there, and a big disparity about how people identified or viewed that peninsula within the local government lens versus the historical lens there. And that is a tension in these documents, I guess, with their purpose and also what they represent. But I think we got some way to sort of reconciling that through the consultation process and through talking to people, who are connected to the site, to understand what we need to represent to make sure we capture.
So one of the just as two examples is some of the history that I'd done in Lambton around World War I, sort of uncovered the depth of and the extent of activity that the women left behind were doing in fundraising in the community that doesn't come out when you're only talking about war and coal mines. What about the women? So we discovered that the women were doing like 2 or 3 fundraisers every week for the entire period of the war. I was like, oh, okay, well, that doesn't get recorded. And then more recently, I've been doing stuff in Wallsend, which is usually coal. It's all coal, but behind that is the impact of churches and choirs and music and education and infrastructure and trams and all of that, which, if it's the social side is what I mean, is it's easy for historians and us generally to see an old building, but the social side is invisible. So I can see a whole lot of that in Wallsend being something which did exist and then sort of got brushed over with the amalgamation into the greater city of Newcastle. But in stuff I've been doing this year, I've actually discovered that Wallsend's sense of community is still there. It's almost like a ghost. And so it's exciting and sad at the same time. So I guess when I was listening to your presentations, I was thinking in much the same way as what Johnny was saying is I hope that the end report captures those things that have been along the timeline and that they don't disappear somehow. I don't know exactly what I mean, but at some point maybe add me into your list and we'll have a talk.
Yes, no, Robert, that's fabulous. And I think what you're also pointing to, which is so important in the work we do and something we always have conversations here with in our firm, is the intangible heritage. So often we're in conversations with archaeologists about, they literally find the artifacts, but obviously in the Aboriginal context, there's so many more layers to country and what that means. And it's not just the literal debitage of that artifact left behind. There's a whole layer there. So, and similarly in non-Aboriginal culture, as you're saying, there's this contribution of people in the community that don't leave behind evidence of that fundraiser, or that activity or that choir. But we know they were like the glue of the community, and it wouldn't have developed without them. So absolutely, we'd love to do justice in some form to that intangible and some of those hidden voices that do get obscured by the big industrial story or the big built form story that remains. Yeah, no, I think it's a really great point. Yeah.
Thank you.
A good contact for women's histories is Dr. Jude Conway. I don't know that she's here today, but she would be a great person for you to contact. The thing that seems to be coming here to me at the moment from the conversation is that it would be very challenging to reverse it inside out. You know, rather than do it all from the outside, we do it from the people perspective or the living bit, you know, and show how these things were all created, you know, the buildings and the institutions and the infrastructure from the people that helped create it, no matter where they came from, you know, and what culture. That would be challenging to see. I've never seen that done before. I don't know how you would do it, but it would be interesting to do it from a people perspective. I mean, if you talk to Jude, she'd give you, I mean, this is sort of Newcastle incarnate. The men would be out there doing the businessy things, raising the money, but the women would be looking after the social infrastructure in a way, building the hospitals because they were sick to death of seeing women give birth in a gutter. I mean, it's a sort of thing. There's some interesting stories there. It would be a different thematic history. I don't know whether the city of Newcastle would accept it or pay your bills, but the thing is that it would be unique from our perspective to have that story told from a distinctly human perspective, you know, and how those different cultures have really come together to create this stuff. Because the AA company brought in shepherds from exotic places overseas. I mean, my father and mother came from Italy during, you know, the 50s to build things, like work in industries. I mean, everyone's got a story of someone who's come in from somewhere to do something, and the flack that they got when they got here, you know, and it quells and it moves on to someone else. So that's sort of dynamic, but it seems to be an interesting theme of reversing it, you know.
Yeah, well, I like the term of social infrastructure. I think that's a good way of, visualising it.
The study is extremely high level, and it's not really, it sounds really weird in my avenue of work, but it's trying to be not too place-based, if you get what I mean, because the studies that follow are very buildings and streets, and this is an opportunity to say, what are the stories, what is the identity, what is unique, what is...
And the approach you can apply generally around the region. Yeah.
Well, it was, I don't know, as long as the outcome is some kind of human happiness and joy, I think that would be across everybody. I mean, that would be unique.
I think also, Johnny, what you're trying to get at in some ways is that both from an Indigenous perspective and a non-Indigenous perspective, Newcastle is a very tribal society. And in many ways, as a lot of us here know, we all represent parts of those tribes along the way. The trick is uniting the tribes. I think I had the pleasure of achieving that once in my career. But I think that dynamic, that tribal dynamic that infects Newcastle is an interesting one. It may come from the original convict heritage interlinking with Indigenous peoples at that time, but there is definitely a very tribal culture here. And I'm only saying that not in a patronising way, ladies, but I think you'll encounter some of the tribes as you move through.
And we've got Novocastrians sitting opposite us every day.
Right.
Being already very tribal amongst each other about.
It's sort of, I know I'm using that rather generically, but it's the only way you can use it in some respects. But it's a very tribal society, and in some senses you're trying to catch a snapshot of that living dynamic rather than a corpse. You know, as they say, if you dissect a frog, you might think you know all about the frog, but the frog ain't going to do any hopping, is it? So anyway, I'll get out of here with that one.
Thanks for that. That's great sum up.
Any other questions? I mean, even just
there was a comment online from Cheryl Ann from the Stockton Historical Society. So Cheryl Ann writes, can I suggest Vera Deakin is identified as a more modern key player whose information can inform in respect of the more modern history of Newcastle. So her records are here, and the Stockton Historical Society and the Friends of the Schoolmasters House at Ash Island.
Fabulous. There's a lovely continuity of women's history at Ash Island too, and the Scott sisters, and the conservation story there too. It's quite a special collection to have.
And also the various things that Paul has been mixed up with over the years with the Alawa place, and the book publishing has been great examples of Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal collaborations. So that sort of idea of relationship, I think, is really important, and it will help create a much more meaningful document.
And there's so many stories here that have been probably well documented since the 90s, and the dual naming of Newcastle, like
that's another good thing.
That happened probably 10 years ago now.
Yeah.
Some of those stories of our town documentaries have got ones themed around Indigenous history. So again, there's stories.
Yeah. Newcastle's one of the few places in the country that actually has a legitimate Aboriginal name. I mean, a real one. And so it's important to really promote that one, you know, and to document it, because it's not going to be documented by the Geographical Names Board, because they sort of don't recognise places of cities for some reason.
No, they're just places.
I wonder why. So that's something, you know, that's something we, I mean, I feel very proud of, that we actually have a real Indigenous name for our place.
Yeah, we'd like to include language as much as possible, just again guided by Gurkai and what they see as appropriate there, inclusive. And we've been looking back towards the chapter they drafted for the heritage study, which we know was authored by them, but certainly want to bring in that contemporary language revival story, as well as key individuals where we can, if they feel that's appropriate. We obviously don't want to get into that thing of favouring one family over another. Or,
yeah. I've got my...
Can I
yeah, sure.
Just a simple thing. It is a thematic story, and we should be able to pick up themes that are constant through and that have changed the place. But all the time, you've got to really understand the idea of the tribal themes too, as the tribes were dispersed and shot and killed. But the colonial history of the town was just imposed on Newcastle by the government of Britain. The AA company, for a start, taking over everything from Brown Street to Pitt Town. And all the railways and things, they're done by the AA company, not by any local government or anything like that. And so Newcastle's got this little bit where councils and the people did have a say, but they were only the people that had property and things like that to start with. Anyway, the thing is that the railways associated with the mines, and you know, they were everything's imposed on Newcastle, and they're creating all the energy. The industrial revolution, which started in England. You know, so sort of the power of Australia mainly came out of Newcastle to start with.
Yeah.
Where the first dollar was made, the first pound was made.
Quickly, Don, and then I have to get onto the book fair people, or else I'll never forget. Thank you, Doug.
Sorry.
Crossover.
I know. I'm just getting very cross. So, okay, Don.
Sorry.
Thanks, Johnny. We're talking about balance and inclusion being the two themes most mentioned so far. Can I just make a comment about the convicts? They were an important part of Newcastle because it was a penal settlement to begin with, but that was only for a very short period of time. Thereafter, the majority of convicts in New South Wales approximately 70% were in private employment. They were not government employed. Most of the history, unfortunately, concentrates on those in government employ, and simply because there are more records about them than the 70% in private employment. With the exception of the AA company, they had something like 15 or 1600 convicts employed. Now, they're all in private employment. Admittedly, many of them were underground in the coal mines in Newcastle, but I would ask that those that form the majority of the convicts in New South Wales and the majority of the convicts who influenced Newcastle and the development of the Hunter Valley were in private employment, not the ones who were necessarily recorded in the courts and jails and so on. I'd like to balance there.
I would add too that resistance to authority is a tremendous theme throughout Newcastle's history. You'll find that right into the modern day. We won't bring the Layman Street pigs in yet, will we, Doug? You and me, the attempt to put us in a paddy wagon.
So it's okay for you guys on Zoom. I'm being threatened with death here in the room.
Resistance to authority, I put that in as a theme in terms of a theme throughout the history of the place. Yep.
Yeah, we've been enjoying reading Radical Newcastle too. That publication is fantastic.
So we'll be meeting with you. Thank you very much, Mina, Leonie, and Tom.
Thank you.
So you'll be getting, yes, you'll be getting. Okay, Leslie, over to you.
Well, it's getting a bit late.
Say something.
Everyone, and yeah, your engagement, really appreciate it. We'll leave you to the rest of your meeting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Leslie.
Can I have a go now?
You've got a whole 2 minutes.
Well, I do have some very happy news that I was trying to get in, but the book fair's on again. It was a biennial, most of you would know, but we had the COVID and everything else, and last year's book fair was absolutely enormous. So we've gone to a yearly, that doesn't matter. We're going to a yearly one now, an annual. See how we go. There's a few reasons. Lack of storage for our books, because we have this time we'll have about 40,000. Last time that's not including records and DVDs and all that. Last time we had about 65 and it was unmanageable and we had nowhere to store them. So anyway, this should be a great one. We're having something special on the 16th of August. That's Friday, an early bird special. We from 4 until 8. Then we have Saturday, Sunday, all day Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Then what else? It's just going to be a great deal of fun. Anyway, there's free parking on the university grounds on the Saturday and the Sunday. We have something new this time. One of our supporters wanted to donate and they didn't have books to donate, so what they did, they donated their mother's collection of collectible dolls, reproductions and things like that. So that's something we tried. We tried art last year. If anyone went last year, we had a wonderful collection of art we sold. So we're diversifying, I suppose you'll say. Anyway, 16th, 4 o'clock is the early bird special. It goes till 8 o'clock, then Saturday, Sunday is 10, open at 10. So it's going to be a great book fair. Please come along, support. Everything goes to scholarships. We don't put any money into capital works.
All scholarships.
All scholarships.
Thank you very much, Leslie. And thank you very much for the friends.
Go.
Okay, that's it. That's us done. So thank you very much for your presence and joining us this afternoon. And we'll see you next month.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.